This mini lesson is going to be about how to use wet in wet technique for creating what I call watercolor skies. This is the first painting that you are either working on or did with me some time ago. And you know, one of the things we were trying to do was to work on how to make these sky areas soft so that there weren't any hard lines. And I told you that I needed for us to wet this entire area first, and then when we would put in the pigment, the first colors, rather than being a hard brush stroke or a hard line, the water and the pigment would run into the wet surface of the paper and create really soft areas here. We could also soften those up later with a Q-tip or with our brush lifting out. But I want to show you how we can create this kind of sky using the wet of the paper and then wet watercolor that we're going to add to it. So I'm going to demonstrate this. We're going to work on this sky first, and then I'm going to show you how to create this tree line so that we get a nice soft tree line but still have a firm snow edge to this land. So I'm going to get a new piece of paper, and we're going to take a look at how to create this. Before we start the painting, I want to talk with you for a minute about how to control the amount of paint and the water, and how to keep your brushes clean and keep your paints from getting too contaminated. You can see in my paint palette the colors are fairly clean. There's always going to be a little bit of contamination, but I try to be careful about trying to keep it as clean as I can so that I get the color that I want. So this is the palette you have been using, and I have my 1/2 inch flat and my 1/4 inch round. My number 4 round, excuse me, is getting a little worn now, but it'll work fine for today. You'll also notice that I have two containers of water. I have a small container and a larger container. Actually, I use a much larger container than this for the water bath. And then I have a source that gives me clean water. When I am using my watercolors and trying to keep from contaminating my paint, I will clean my brushes in the larger water bath, and then once the brush is fairly clean, I dip it into the cleaner water to use with wetting the paint. Now, one of the things I want to say to you right at the beginning here is that I noticed that when you first started painting using watercolor, you may not know how to get the water and the paint in the right mixture. And oftentimes I will see people take the brush, wet the brush, stroke into the dry paint, and then paint onto the watercolor board. Well, certainly that color is going to be very rich, but you're not going to have much water to help spread it around, and you tend to get harder edges, flatter edges. Sometimes that's fine, but a common technique I like to use before I start to paint is to wet the areas that I'm going to use with a little bit of water. And you'll notice I'm not trying to brush around. I'm taking the brush and loading it with water and putting maybe 2 drops into the paint area. That's just to get it started so that the paint begins to soften. You do not need this tool, but oftentimes I will use an eyedropper to do the same thing, and then I'm not using my brush. But for today, we're just going to use the brush. I'm going to set the eyedropper off to the side. Now, let's take a look at just a piece of watercolor paper here for just a minute. If I dip my brush into the paint and my paper is dry, I can make a stroke, and these brush strokes will actually have hard edges to them. Depending upon how much paint I've loaded into my brush and how much water, I can make it fairly dark. Or I can wash my brush here a little bit and try to load it more with water than with paint, and I can have a fairly dilute paint and a fainter or shallow color there. Now, if I take my flat and I wet the paper, we did this earlier, but I just want to make sure you see this, and I wet my paper first, and then I take my brush and I dip it into paint. When I draw a line this time, you'll notice that the paint doesn't set up as a hard line, but begins to fan out, and it gives you these soft feathered edges. Well, in a wet watercolor sky, that's what we're looking for. We want to get these edges to be very soft so that after the paint dries, or excuse me, yeah, after the paint dries, you will have gotten these feathered areas. Now, because of the slope of this board, I may be getting a little bit of a feathered edge to one side versus the other. I can always take care of that by, of course, dipping the board. Oh, notice, here's something very important to point out to you. Notice I got a really nice feathered edge here, but what happened here? Well, when I took a look at the paper and I tilted it, lo and behold, I didn't cover all of the area. So this is a great example of, by not being careful to cover all of the painted area, you get this nice soft feathered edge on the part that had wet paper, but because there was a little bit of dry paper, I got this hard edge. So when we start this painting in a minute, when we look at these skies, I'm going to need to make sure that that area of sky is completely covered with water first, so I get these nice soft feathered edges. All right, so what I'm going to do now is set up the painting that we are working on, or you have worked on in the past, and I'm going to demonstrate how to do that watercolor sky.